You know what's really fun? Being the prime minister with a massive majority and still managing to lose votes because your own MPs think you're bonkers. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, and today we're talking about Keir Starmer's latest backbench rebellion, where 39 Labour MPs have told him exactly where he can stick his plans to scrap jury trials. That's right, the government that promised to restore trust, uphold British values, and respect the rule of law has decided that actually jury trials are a bit inconvenient, and maybe we should just get rid of most of them. And shockingly, absolutely shockingly, some Labour MPs have looked at this proposal and thought, you know what, this might be a terrible idea that tramples on fundamental rights and makes us look like authoritarians. So grab your wigs and gavels because we're diving into the rebellion that's making Starmer look increasingly ineffectual, increasingly desperate, and increasingly like a prime minister who's lost control of his own party less than 6 months into the job. Right, let's start with what's actually being proposed here, because it's genuinely shocking. The government wants to restrict jury trials so that only murder, rape, manslaughter, and certain public interest cases get heard by juries. Everything else, all the other Crown Court cases that currently go before 12 ordinary citizens, would be decided by judges alone. According to Ministry of Justice modeling, this would cut the number of jury trials in half. In half. We're talking about one of the fundamental pillars of the British justice system, the right to be judged by a jury of your peers, something that's been a cornerstone of our legal system for centuries, and the government wants to slash it by 50% to clear a court backlog. Now, before anyone says, well, the backlog is a real problem and we need to do something about it, yes, absolutely, the Crown Court backlog is massive. There are tens of thousands of cases waiting to be heard, victims waiting years for justice, defendants stuck in legal limbo, the whole system is creaking. But here's the thing. There are lots of ways to tackle a court backlog. You could hire more judges, you could increase court sitting days, you could invest in the infrastructure and staff needed to process cases faster. What you probably shouldn't do is take a fundamental right that's existed for centuries and bin it because it's administratively inconvenient. That's like solving traffic congestion by banning cars. Technically it works, but you've also destroyed something pretty important in the process. The backlash has been swift and brutal. Karl Turner, the Labour MP for Hull East, has written to the Prime Minister along with 38 other Labour backbenchers urging him to drop the plans. The letter is signed by some serious heavyweight names, including Diane Abbott, the mother of the House of Commons, who's been an MP since 1987 and has probably forgotten more about parliamentary rebellions than most current MPs will ever know. These aren't just random backbenchers who'll vote however the whips tell them. These are people with principles, with experience, and with enough political capital that they can afford to tell the Prime Minister he's wrong. The letter itself is absolutely scathing. It calls the proposals an ineffective way of dealing with the crippling backlog, and says restricting jury trials is not a silver bullet. The MPs write to limit a fundamental right for what will make a marginal difference to the backlog, if any, is madness and will cause more problems than it solves. Madness. They're calling their own government's policy madness. That's not constructive criticism, that's a declaration of war. And Karl Turner made it even clearer on social media, saying that many more MPs who didn't sign the letter have said they'll rebel if necessary. So we're not talking about 39 rebels, we're talking about potentially dozens more who are waiting to see if Starmer backs down or if they need to vote against him. Now let's talk about the substance of why this is such a terrible idea. Jury trials aren't just a nice tradition or a quaint historical quirk. They're a fundamental safeguard against state power. When you're accused of a serious crime, you don't want your fate decided by a single judge who might be having a bad day, who might have unconscious biases, who might be influenced by political pressure. You want 12 ordinary people from your community, people who have no connection to the legal establishment, who can look at the evidence and decide whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. That's not just about fairness to defendants, though that's obviously crucial, it's also about public confidence in the justice system. When ordinary people are involved in delivering justice, the public trusts the system more. When justice becomes something done entirely by professional elites behind closed doors, trust evaporates. Senior legal sources, and we're talking about people who've spent their entire careers in the justice system, have warned that Labour is intent on removing the rights of ordinary people and taking taking an axe to British justice and fairness. These aren't hysterical campaigners or opposition politicians looking for an attack line. These are serious legal professionals who understand how the system works and who are genuinely alarmed by what the government is proposing. And they should be alarmed because this is genuinely alarming. We're watching a government with a huge majority use that power to strip away rights and protections that have existed for generations, all in the name of administrative efficiency. The letter from the REBELL MPs suggests a bunch of sensible alternatives. They point out that around 130,000 sitting days are available to courts, but sitting days are currently restricted by 20,000 a year despite the crisis. In other words, courts could be operating more days than they currently are, but they're artificially limited. The government has announced plans to increase sitting days by 5,000, which sounds good until you realize that still leaves a 15,000 shortfall compared to what theoretically is possible. So here's a radical idea. Instead of scrapping jury trials, how about you just let courts sit more often? Pay judges to work more days, keep courtrooms open longer, invest in the system so it can handle the workload. Novel concept, I know. But that would cost money, and this government is obsessed with not spending anything except their own pet projects. They've got billions to give to the EU for Erasmus, but apparently they can't find the resources to properly fund the justice system. They've got money for foreign aid and climate initiatives, but justice? Sorry, can't afford it. We'll just have to scrap your right to a jury trial instead. It's a question of priorities, and this government's priorities are completely out of whack with what ordinary people care about. The historical comparison in the letter is particularly pointed. The MPs write, every day during the Second World War, juries continued to sit, reverting from 12 to 7 jurors. We are not at war. Let that sink in. During the Second World War, when Britain was fighting for its very survival, when bombs were falling on London and resources were stretched to breaking point, the country still maintained jury trials. They adapted them, sure, reducing from 12 to 7 jurors to make it easier to get juries together, but they kept them. Because even in the darkest hour, even when the nation faced an existential threat, British leaders understood that some things are too important to abandon. And now, in 2025, when we're not being bombed, when we're not fighting a total war, when the country is actually relatively peaceful and prosperous, this government wants to scrap jury trials because there's a court backlog. The comparison is devastating. Starmer's response to all this has been typically tone-deaf. When Carl Turner confronted him at Prime Minister's questions, Starmer said juries will remain a cornerstone of our justice system for the most serious cases. But that's exactly the problem. Who decides what's serious? The government's proposal says murder, rape, and manslaughter get juries. Fine, but what about serious assault? What about armed robbery? What about cases involving millions of pounds, or cases where someone's entire life and reputation are on the line, even if it's not technically murder or rape? Are those not serious enough to deserve a jury? And who gets to decide what counts as a public interest case that deserves a jury? The government? Judges? Civil servants? That's an enormous amount of discretion and power being handed to the state, and there are zero guarantees it won't be abused. Starmer also tried to downplay the significance by saying jury trials already make up a small proportion of trials in the criminal court system. And that's true. Most criminal cases are dealt with in magistrates' courts where there are no juries. But Crown Court cases, the ones we're talking about here, are by definition the most serious cases in the system. These are cases where defendants face significant prison sentences, where lives are destroyed or vindicated based on the verdict. Saying, oh, it's only a small proportion of trials, completely misses the point. It's like saying, oh, we're only removing human rights protections for a small proportion of people, so it's fine. The number doesn't matter. The principle matters. Some MPs have called for a sunset clause on these proposals, so that once the court backlog is cleared, jury trials would be restored. And that sounds reasonable on the surface, but think about it for a second. When has any government ever voluntarily given back power it's taken? When has a temporary erosion of rights ever turned out to be actually temporary? These things have a habit of becoming permanent because once you've got the system set up to work without juries, once you've saved the money, once you've gotten used to the convenience, there's no incentive to change it back. The backlog will never be fully cleared anyway. There will always be delays, always be cases waiting, and the government will always be able to say, now's not the right time to restore jury trials. We'll do it when things are better, which means never. The politics of this is also fascinating because the rebellion is being led largely by the left of the Labour Party. These are the MPs who've been marginalized under Starmer's leadership, who were purged from front-bench positions, who've watched as the party moved away from the Corbyn-era policies they supported. And now they found an issue where they're absolutely right, where they can claim the moral high ground and where they can embarrass Starmer by showing he's out of touch with Labour values. Diane Abbott signing that letter is symbolically massive. She's a totemic figure for the Labour left. She's been fighting these battles for decades, and her name on the letter gives it weight and credibility. But it's not just the left rebelling. The letter talks about a growing number of colleagues who aren't prepared to support these proposals. That suggests a rebellion crosses factional lines within the party, because restricting jury trials isn't a left-right issue. It's a civil liberties issue, and there are plenty of Labour MPs from all wings of the party who care deeply about civil liberties and who are horrified by what the government is proposing. And Starmer has spent so much time trying to appear tough on law and order, trying to position himself as the anti-Corbyn candidate who takes crime seriously, that he's ended up proposing something that's actually authoritarian and illiberal. And Labour MPs, whatever their other disagreements, generally don't like voting for authoritarian policies. The comparison to other Starmer rebellions is instructive. He's already faced rebellions over the winter fuel allowance, over Gaza policy, over various other issues. Each time he's had to either back down or force the vote through with a significantly reduced majority, and each rebellion makes him look weaker.